All right, while we are talking about the lies that lead us to war, it's a great time to talk about Julian Assange, because Assange spoke publicly for the first time since he's been released today in Europe. And I want to say the Trump campaign should absolutely have to answer for what it did to Julian Assange. Now, Trump has many times on the campaign said that during his first administration, he had bad advisors and he was surrounded by bad people, and he will not do that again. That's fine. I want to ask him about what happened to Julian Assange. Is that an example of those bad people who were pulling the puppet strings? Would he do something different? Is he upset at specifically the two people who were bad? So what Assange said is that he was persecuted, prosecuted, tortured by wolves, two wolves specifically in MAGA hats. So he was speaking about his political imprisonment at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. It's called PACE. He said that he now finds the climate of journalism even worse than when he started his imprisonment. Hard to argue with that right now. Now, he accused the U.S. Justice Department under President Trump of using a, quote, radical and ominous interpretation of the U.S. Constitution to prosecute him. Recall that of all the war crimes the United States has perpetuated in the last few decades, Julian Assange is the only one to be punished. He's the only one to point out that we were lied to. Good to remember that on a day like that. They lied to us to get us to support war. He's the only one who was ever punished by that. So on a day when today we see a massive attack by Iran into Israel, recall that lies lead us to war. The first casualty of war is the truth. So let's look at someone who was prosecuted for the truth. He said that this was done during the Trump years by two wolves in MAGA hats. Listen.
Ultimately, this harassment was legally groundless. President Obama's Justice Department chose not to indict me, recognizing that no crime had been committed. The United States had never before prosecuted a publisher for publishing or obtaining government information. To do so would require a radical and ominous reinterpretation of the US Constitution. In January 2017, Obama also commuted the sentence of Manning, who had been convicted of being one of my sources. However, in February 2017, the landscape changed dramatically. President Trump had been elected. He appointed two wolves in MAGA hats, Mike Pompeo, a Kansas congressman and former arms industry executive, as CIA director, and William Barr, a former CIA officer, as US Attorney General. By March 2017, WikiLeaks had exposed the CIA's infiltration of French political parties, its spying on French and German leaders, its spying on the European Central Bank, European economics ministries, and its standing orders to spy on French industry as a whole. We revealed the CIA's vast production of malware and viruses, its subversion of supply chains, its subversion of antivirus software, cars, smart TVs, and iPhones. CIA Director Pompeo launched a campaign of retribution. It is now a matter of public record that under Pompeo's explicit direction, the CIA drew up plans to kidnap and to assassinate me within the Ecuadorian embassy in London, and authorized going after my European colleagues, subjecting us to theft, hacking attacks, and the planting of false information. My wife and my infant son were also targeted. A CIA asset was permanently assigned to track my wife, and instructions were given to obtain DNA from my 6-month-old son's nappy. This is the testimony of more than 30 current and former US intelligence officials speaking to the US press, which has been additionally corroborated by records seized in a prosecution brought against some of the CIA agents involved. The CIA's targeting of myself, my family, and my associates through aggressive extrajudicial and extraterritorial means provides a rare insight into how powerful intelligence organizations engage in transnational repression.
Okay, so do you want to just for a second say he looks pretty good, right? We had been really worried that his health was deteriorating.
Yeah.
The fact that he can even speak this clearly.
I bet it really chaps the U.S. government's ass that he's sitting in a suit out free, just talking to people.
Yeah.
After all that they
telling
put
the
him
truth.
through it. Exactly.
Yeah.
And you know, we had Glenn Greenwald on the show, and when he saw him in prison, or in the embassy, he said he couldn't believe he looked like a totally different human being.
Right.
You know, so to see him actually having some food and, you know, being with his family.
Some sun and things like that. Yeah. So a couple questions we should absolutely demand answers to before we go to the polls. Number one, does the CIA still launch spyware and malware on us and other allies, so-called allies? You know, I do find some comfort in the fact that RFK Jr. wants to look into these things and investigate the CIA. Sure. I want to hear more about how they will then be held account to what they did to Julian Assange. Number two, does anyone want to check on those wolves in MAGA hats? Mike Pompeo actually tried to murder a journalist as an official act of the U.S. government. Does anyone want to do something about that?
Well, he's actively, and of course, that's the big concern. This is the concern that Colonel Douglas McGregor has about President Trump. He worked, and by the way, he worked for President Trump. His biggest concern is that those same deep state swamp rats, like Mike Pompeo, who's, as Tucker calls him, a criminal.
How'd he get that job?
How does he get this job? And is Trump going to consider putting this swamp rat back in place again? Or people like scumbag, you know, like Jared Kushner, like these types of deep state swamp rats, these people who are actively trying to undermine him. I mean, Jared Kushner allegedly worked with Mike Pence, directly with Mike Pence, to undermine President Trump. So again, is he going to surround himself with these people, and or is he put up some barriers around this?
I want some answers on that. Again, he goes on to say that William Barr was talked into indicting him based on pressure from Mike Pompeo because they were CIA bedfellows, essentially. So what do U.S. leaders have to say about that? It's not supposed to happen. And what does President Trump have to say about this? Now, this happened on his watch when the Obama administration, despite trying to prosecute Julian Assange, they realized the law was not on their side and they gave it up. They let that bone go. But the Trump administration perverted the law to their will. So what does he have to say about that? And how can we make sure it does not happen again? How can we hold somebody accountable besides Julian Assange? How can we do that? Now, he mentioned that he'd been subject to terrifying abuse, but he said he's still not even quite ready to talk about it. Like, he can't even talk about it, you guys. One shudders to think, but he did speak out about former CIA and WikiLeaks whistleblower Joshua Schulte, who was sentenced to 40 years of prison just this year and is currently, right now as we speak, under extreme isolation watch.
This assembly is no stranger to extraterritorial abuses by the CIA. Pace's groundbreaking report on CIA renditions in Europe exposed how the CIA operated secret detention centers and conducted unlawful renditions on European soil, violating human rights and international law. In February this year, the alleged source of some of our CIA revelations, former CIA officer Joshua Schulte, was sentenced to 40 years in prison under conditions of extreme isolation. His windows are blacked out, and a white noise machine plays 24 hours a day over his door so that he cannot even shout through it. These conditions are more severe than those found in Guantanamo Bay.
Okay, that's one of our own. right? We have him now in these types of conditions. I'm not familiar with the details of his case, but when you look up the indictment, it says that he was guilty of espionage and child pornography. So you wonder if, how those things get thrown at people who speak out against the U.S. government. I don't know. I did not look into what he actually had, what the government has on him. But I do think the Biden administration needs to be pushed on the conditions of this severe torture of this person right now, don't you? Also, notice what I highlighted here. Schulte was prosecuted. Can we go back to that screen before? I'm sorry. Was prosecuted by the same person who is currently prosecuting Diddy and New York City Mayor Adams. That's Damian Williams, the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York. So that guy's busy. I'm not claiming any links here. I just noticed that this guy keeps popping up in my research recently. So interesting. Now, after this speech, Assange was asked how this case relates to European freedoms and how Europe can do it better, what Europe should worry about. Now, no one in that room had any it was as if everyone agreed the U.S. is the bully there, and no one thought the U.S. would ever do better, full stop. That's just like, well, we know the U.S., they're the bullies. How can we stop doing what they tell us to do, basically? How can we stop denying people asylum if the United States decides they're an enemy? How can we stop this? Europe is their cronies. How can we stop? That was the temperature of that press conference. And it makes me so sad as an American that they know America is going to keep being the bully. How can we stop doing what the bully wants? Unless our own politicians are held accountable, which we don't seem to have an appetite for. So I'm still pissed, but I enjoyed this little bit of Assange's insight into his reintegration into family life and the world. I'll end with this because it's a bit of levity.
My readaptation to the world, of course, includes some positive but still tricky things. Becoming a father again to children who have grown up without me. Becoming a husband again. Even dealing with a mother-in-law. These are trying family issues. No, she's a very lovely woman. I like her very much.
She turns his microphone off. She's like, "You're done talking about my mom."
That's great.
Yeah, that was kind of a sweet moment, and I'll leave it at that because it does seem like this person is going to be allowed to live his life for now. Knocking on wood. So.